Um, all right, well, welcome to this session here hosted by the ESIP schema.org cluster. And today we had planned to do a couple things. So first one, just to give a brief introduction to what the cluster is, why we exist, what sort of motivates us, what outputs and outcomes we're hoping for, um, and jump into some of those outputs. And the one that we really want to focus on is this ESIP endorsement and discuss whether this is a good idea, why, if there are issues there or things that might not make it a good idea, to hear those and hash that out. But then if we do decide that this is something we want to pursue, think about that in terms of a roadmap and a timeline there, so we can get that done, and what we need to do on our side to do that, how to present our content in the best possible way there. And then if and when we can wrap that up before the end of the session, we are really close to publishing the next version of the guidelines and should have that done by the end of the day. And there's a couple issues there where it'd be great to get community feedback on to wrap that up. And so we can tackle that. And then another great topic, which is probably even more important than the 1.2, while we have everyone here in the room, is to discuss progress on dataset variables. We've been working on that for a good while, and Steve Richards just held a poster at the Research Showcase on Wednesday, so it'd be great to hop into that issue a little bit. The link to the Google Notes is obviously in Kiko, but you can find it on this slide if you're in the slides. I've put sections in there for these 3 or 4 topics, so if you want to take notes there, please do that. That'd be great. Okay, so if you're new to the group, we are the schema.org cluster, and we exist to put forth common publishing patterns for describing research data on the web using schema.org markup. And so there's been this revolution in web publishing surrounding schema.org and the search engines. And this sort of generated out of the science data management world of, hey, we work with metadata like ISO and DOI metadata and EML and all these other great rich resources. And so the focus of this cluster is really to marry those two and figure out how to take the existing work that we do with research data and bring that to web publishing. And so what's come out of that is a set of guidelines, and that those guidelines are really intended for encouraging shared publishing patterns. And the drivers behind that are just sort of reliable, consistent, or what those things enable is reliable and consistent federation across all these data repositories. And it seems like there's a ton of them. And so if we can have these shared publishing patterns, we can strive more towards this ability to federate across ourselves using the web architecture, which is really great and sort of like minimal effort to gain this, or minimal effort on the publishing side to gain this capability. And then the other nice reason to have shared publishing patterns is that it allows us to automate validation, which is really cool when we think about federating across data repositories, and specifically in the geosciences domain, having that capability to democratize how we describe research data on the web. All right, so the activities of the cluster are sort of threefold. One, we sort of monitor the monthly updates that are happening over at schema.org, and that work happens in GitHub by this sort of community of folks at Google and maybe Yahoo and Bing and other major search engines. And they put out monthly releases, and so we monitor those for changes to their schema.org vocabulary so that we can improve and keep our guidelines up to date. And so we meet bi-monthly and accept contributions and issues over at GitHub. So we manage all of sort of our to-dos in GitHub, which has been a great way for this ESIP cluster to sort of reach outside of the 2 monthly meetings that we can hold. And then ultimately, we're doing all this so that we can maintain and publish updates to these guidelines. And those guidelines centrally focus on how to describe a data repository on the web. And that's specifically a repository that has research data artifacts in it. And then ultimately how to describe that scientific data set. And you'll see links down here to get involved with us, and there'll be links at the end of the presentation to do that as well. So just giving a high-level overview of this data repository guideline, what we try to do is just sort of put together documents that have more than what you'll find at the schema.org pages themselves, which are really just sort of flat listings of how to describe these things. And it's really hard to get a sense of how conceptually elements in schema.org fit together. And so our guidelines sort of try to make shapes over those schema.org concepts to help our community sort of better understand how these things fit together. And so this is just showing you how we use links in the guidelines and drawings to describe or communicate those ideas. And here I'm just showing just a listing of all the things that we do to describe a data set. And so you'll find, common properties like identifiers and variables, how to talk about its catalog, where to talk or describe the metadata resources, temporal and spatial coverages, funding, licensing, and a whole host of other properties there. And just to give you some more visuals, what we do is we have these markdown records that have these images embedded, descriptions of what we're trying to describe, but also code snippets so that folks that can come in and need to get this sort of implemented, have examples to work off of. So it's not just like a purely conceptual exercise. And then this is just more code and drawings here just to illustrate how we differ from the work that's happening over at schema.org. Okay, I wonder if I see Chantel on the line. So one of the things that became obvious to most of you and not to me, because I guess I'm pretty technical, was that these guidelines were written almost with a very deep dive into how to implement technically. And so folks pointed out that we really needed this higher level overarching description of how and why for the research data repositories and their managers. And I wanted to put together a slide here to point to some work that Chantel Very and Karen Payne have been doing out of the World Data System. And they've put together this amazing primer document. And I put together the table of contents for that document, but I haven't linked to it. Chantel, is it okay to put a link to your Google Doc out to the community, or did you have some other form that you wanted folks to check out there?
Yeah, since we're still in the draft stages, a link is fine. I can drop it in the chat since I have it handy. Okay, great.
So I would encourage you guys, check this out. And Chantel, if you're taking feedback there, I think it's in suggestion mode or whatever. So please take a look at that and distribute to folks that might find that beneficial. All right. So just to give you a sense of what our releases look like, we use GitHub to publish these guidance documentation. We use GitHub's release infrastructure to publish those releases. We connect it to Zenodo so that each release gets a DOI. And then we put together release notes that describe all the changes that have happened in that particular release with links out to the decisions and how those were formed, the specific GitHub issues, so you can see the broader context and discussion, and then, if applicable, links directly into the guides or other resources in the repository. And this last release, which was published in April, we had 7 contributors, which is fantastic. It started out as 2 people, and having 7 is fantastic. Really excited about that. And I think we even have more contributors for this next release. So that's great. So this next release here, just wanted to demonstrate kind of what we're looking at. We are really, like I said, we're really close to wrapping this up. And we've made some good improvements and have some others pushed to our next release, version 1.3, that we hope to have out by the summer, which really aligns with our thoughts about the ESIP Assembly endorsement. And so this next release, 1.3, is what we were kind of framing as, you know, the release that we would put forth to the assembly there. Yeah, and in that we've just, in addition to what we've seen in 1.2, just working on authoritative copy of data sets, how to use the schema citation field, which if you were at yesterday's plenary with Natasha, is something that they're using in the Google Dataset search tool to link publications on Google Scholar to data sets, which is really exciting. We want to wrap up the dataset variable work, some OWL time extensions, and then just a restructuring of the README for the potential ESIP endorsement. All right, so I want this remaining time to be really informal and just open discussion here. And so I've just put together some quick slides as prompts. If you've had a chance to look at the ESIP endorsement, I just pulled out a couple notable things there to prompt this discussion. And so I'll just quickly highlight these and then we can open it up for thoughts. So the ESIP endorsement really seems to be triggered by a community consensus that is built within ESIP on highly relevant and timely products, services, or issues. And so that's something to consider whether we fall into that category with our guidelines. You know, are we hitting that mark? And the goal of these endorsements is obviously to bring concordance and direction for the benefit of the larger community. And so I don't know if we need to discuss or bring up or demonstrate collaboration with other ESIP clusters or communities there. So that maybe that's something to talk about. And then ultimately the results are, you know, this statement of public agreement or support that doesn't really bind members to doing anything. So it's more of just a recommendation that ESIP stands behind. So without having to read to you all, maybe we can just start to have this discussion about whether the guidelines are a good fit for ESIP endorsement and how folks feel about that.
Adam, can you, this is Lewis, and you know, I think I'm going to take the liberty here to say I think you guys have done a tremendous job here, to be quite honest with you. I also want to say a huge thank you for arranging the plenary yesterday. It was very enlightening. I think a lot of people are very interested in this kind of stuff, Adam. So good job to all of the, you know, the cluster for persisting with this. To be quite honest, the question I had was, can you post, please, into the chat the direct link to the proposed endorsement that we can have a wee look at it? Or is it already, did Chantel already post it? Am I behind here?
No, that's a good question, Lewis. So we haven't started a document yet to start to build out the endorsement.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's a good question. What we were trying to discuss today is really, and so the reason that this is coming up is that last summer meeting, we had some discussions with ESIP leadership about, hey, is this a good fit? And there was some concern that it might not be because it's, you know, dependent on another technology. You know, it's, yeah. So I think the question here is this something that people want to see? And does it make sense for ESIP to endorse this type of activity before we go ahead and start putting that stuff together?
So one of the ways I would maybe phrase that as well, Adam, is the inverse. Is, you know, let me try and think about that. Does the community, what does this community do in the event that something like an endorsement doesn't happen? Right? Maybe that's one of the ways I would think about this. You know, the standard, quote unquote, standard has been certainly used. It has been, well, I mean, I don't know anybody else that's on the call that's literally picked up the guidelines and have implemented them, but we certainly have a long time ago. So, you know, I don't know what people have, I don't know what the ESIP Federation has to lose by, or, I mean, as I said, I'm kind of struggling to phrase this, but I think the ESIP community has quite a lot to benefit from these being endorsed. That's my opinion. I think that we do have, we can benefit from them being proposed, and at least more eyes getting on this type of stuff. I mean, there was a lot of interest yesterday, Adam. Everybody saw that, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So Adam, this is Matt. I also agree. I think there's tremendous benefit of getting the ESIP community behind it. I think it's an expression of kind of community direction that if everybody were to agree across the organizations that this is a good idea to follow, then I think it will have a lot of power in improving interoperability for data sharing that would be, you know, it's at the core of what ESIP does. I think for me, the only challenge here is this restriction number 1 that you've got listed on the slide, which says that ESIP will never endorse a particular technology standard, which this really is. I mean, the schema.org approach to metadata markup is one vocabulary among many that we know are in use across this collection of organizations at ESIP. And I think what we would need to be careful of is making sure that we're not trying to say that this recommendation is not that we should use schema.org at the exclusion of some of these other approaches that you know, oftentimes have richer metadata models. I mean, we all know that schema.org, although it's really nice that it is shared across the web community, it doesn't have the level of semantic precision that most of the metadata models that have been in common use for the last 20 years in our community have. And so it is a way to, you know, get high level interoperability at the web level. And I think some of the ways we've, you know, had the guidelines link out to the richer metadata models allows us to promote interoperability through a lowest common denominator. And I think it's great. I don't think anybody would, you know, object to having sort of a community consensus on that, as long as we're not trying to exclude the other standards that are out there, which are also have their, I think, very appropriate roles in the community.
I have to agree.
I agree very much as well. I don't know if, is that you, Steve, that's coming in?
Yeah, I started.
Yeah, sorry, sir, on you go.
Well, I was just going to say, I think we could couch it in terms of we're not endorsing a particular standard. What we're saying is, if you do use schema.org, here are some recommendations about how to make it interoperable. So I think I would say we could argue we're not actually endorsing the standard. We're just saying, if you use it, here's how to use it so it works with everybody else. And just speaking from my experience in the EarthCube community, I know that people have been clamoring for some kind of standard guidelines for how to do this sort of thing. And you know, we tried for a long time with some of the other metadata schemes that have gotten some traction, but this particular approach has gained a lot of traction. And I think people are really, you know, want to be able to use it, and providing the recommendations to help people, I think there's a lot of demand for that. I think it's a really good thing that for ESIP to do.
I agree, and I agree. I will say as well, the last comment, Matt, that on number 1, I think you make an excellent point. I really hate getting caught out by technicalities, though. I think you know, to get around that, we're talking about an extension, a community developed extension here, which to me, you know, is not developed by commerce for commercial purposes, right? So I don't feel that it's I don't feel that there is a technicality there, to be honest with you. You know, that's my point on that. That's my position on this one.
Is that a link to the other previous ESIP endorsements up there at the top there, Adam?
That link brings you to ESIP.
I'm just thinking, looking at a list of what has been endorsed might give us an idea of similar things that we could.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Bring up. That's okay. This has already been endorsed. This is similar to what we're doing. I don't know if that's true, but.
Yep. I think other folks on the call have gone through this process, like Ruth with data citation. Is that correct? Did we lose Ruth or others folks on the call? Please feel free to chime in.
Yeah, no, this is Ruth. And yes, I was muted. Yes, that's correct. Data citations were initially endorsed, and that was the first endorsement that ESIP ever made. And that was about 10 years ago now. And since then, that has been updated, I guess, a year ago. But one of the reasons why I strongly liked endorsement is because it kind of, ESIP is sponsored by NASA, NOAA, and USGS, right? And what happened with the citations is that those groups actually ended up going off and starting to implement the guidelines. And that had a pretty strong impact on, in my opinion, the entire research community. And so, the idea of ESIP as a place where we can help move the entire community geoscience research community forward, is something I think that would be good for, not just, yes, I see Peter Fox's comment. Yes, Ruth, move the needle forward. Anyways, so that's why I originally suggested we do this even.
Yeah, let me ask you, do we need to demonstrate adoption?
No. And when the original citation guidelines were endorsed, nobody had adopted them, but there was just a strong call within the assembly that this is the kind of thing that ESIP should be doing, and that if we didn't do this, it would be a bad thing. So, it's a question of, can you demonstrate that a community of 150 or so groups thinks that something is worthy of calling something worth to do.
Yeah, agree, Peter. Demonstrate consensus. So it sounds like we've heard from folks that are in support of this activity. Do we have anyone on the call that might have pause or cause for concern?
I think it's great. We should try to get this approved. But if the bylines are ESIP will never endorse a particular technology standard, we need to understand how this is not a technology standard, it's something else.
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity here as well to influence the what is endorsement at ESIP.
Yeah, we can do that too.
I think that's what's coming on here, because that's open. Anybody can do that. It's within the bylaws. Anybody can do that. Propose a change to what we're trying to do here. That's absolutely within the remit of the membership.
But I'm not convinced that is necessary, because we aren't excluding other community standards. We're trying to interoperate with other community standards, and we're not endorsing schema.org as a technology solution to the whole world, but as part of a solution to make federation easier. So it's not really endorsing that technology, and it's certainly going well beyond, the schema.org, statements, which is very, very loose, which is, I think, the reason why we're doing this.
Yeah, Ruth, I've had actually people say to me in work that information artifacts are not technology, and therefore, they're under different. There's a different policy for information artifacts than there is for software. So it's not in the software. Software is considered as technology, and the information artifacts are not. and therefore, you know, something like a schema is not technology. I mean, I think we're probably diverging quite dramatically here, but I get where you're going with that one, Ruth. And I think that you're right. It might not be a call to try and change something within the bylaws and whatever. I mean, that's quite a dramatic step forward. I would just like to see the whole thing go forward. I don't see any reason why you shouldn't.
Cool. I want to call up everybody's to Denise's comment in the chat about the governance committee and the interpretation of the endorsement language. Denise was past governance chair and is our incoming vice president. So if people are serious about needing to get that language clarified, she would be a good person to talk to, or Bill Tang, who's the incoming chair.
Well, can we just, Denise, you're on now. Do you mind clarifying whether you think that there are any issues that, as you know, around what we're discussing? Because, you know, Peter seems to indicate he doesn't think it is, and in the following comment, and just curious if you also think something we should clarify.
My reading of it is the same as Peter's, that this is not endorsement of a particular technology, but rather guidance, a convention that might apply to a particular technology, but it's not necessarily exclusive to that technology, if that makes sense. At least that's my interpretation of what is being proposed.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, it isn't endorsing a commercial product or a specific technology. It is endorsement of the convention or the guidelines.
That makes perfect sense to me.
Seems good.
Yeah.
Makes perfect sense.
And I think when you write the proposal, you might want to be sure to include language like that, in case, you know, governance committee can obviously help provide guidance and when it goes to the board, but having it in the proposal with kind of saying, hey, we understand that some of you may read this and go, wait, what? You know, we say we're not going to do this particular thing, and kind of do the explanation that it's actually not that. So.
Great. So I have another related question to this endorsement issue, which is I wanted to talk about what the content of it would be. I was involved in the version 2 of the data citation endorsement and trying to put that together. And in that activity, we really focused on actually developing out the recommendations and the guidelines for citation, and the endorsement itself. The proposal document for the endorsement outlines exactly what should happen, and I put a link in the chat to the document that came out. So in an analogous way, I think what we would be doing on the scienceonschema.org side would be incorporating our current guidelines into the endorsement. And my question is really around, is that what we want to do, or do we want to treat these guidelines more as a living set of guidelines that we anticipate will continue to evolve? Because as Dan said in his plenary talk yesterday, that, you know, the schema.org guidelines themselves evolve relatively rapidly, and it is sort of a very actively moving community. And so I'm curious about whether we want to include those specific content recommendations in the guidelines, or if we want to make a more general statement that talks about them as a living document.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question for us to address. So I'm curious what people think there.
Mike, I think it's possible to have multiple versions of an endorsement. For example, we're on version 2 of the citation guidelines. The concern is that people who are implementing probably, or at least a lot of the repositories that I know would struggle if there were frequent major changes in the guidance. Extending the guidance, I think, would not be a problem because people could choose to extend or not. But changing guidance for existing, like identifier guidance or any particular field, changing that dramatically would mean that many repositories would be several iterations behind. So for the main sections, I do think that it should be fairly stable. And I do think that it's okay to go for, like yearly or every other year or something like that, major revisions. But I would like to see it be for the, for the main guidelines, that, for the things that are more or less required by the community, that those should be fairly stable before it's endorsed. At least that's my opinion. That's not to say that there's not always going to be ongoing work, because yeah, I know, I agree, there will be.
Ruth, I think you're totally right. I was about to put in the chat there, folks. I'll just say it here very quickly. I think thinking past an event which is maybe a proposal to the ESIP community for an endorsement of X, Y, and Z, whatever. What is the sustainability of this cluster past that? And if it's in a maintenance mode, that's probably quite a healthy mode to move on with. I think you make some good points, Ruth, and I personally think that I was talking about like earlier on the support model. I'm not saying like people are going to come in and help you out individually with this, that, and the next thing, but it's what does this cluster look like post endorsement? That's maybe without the out with the this slide that you're showing, Adam. But long story short is I think it would be great to get this out here and get some feedback on it. But that's my bottom line.
Yeah, okay. Maybe we can shift the conversation to the planning here of, sounds like, yes, we want to attempt this. And so we can move on to this next slide of proposal contents and maybe help shape that and then put together a roadmap. And I'm clicking the wrong thing here, present. Okay, so in that same endorsement.
Adam,
yeah.
May I?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go for it.
So two things. One is in regard to Lewis's comment about the cluster and the current activity. Don't worry. ESIP, even if the cluster ends tomorrow, there will be a group in ESIP, a cluster, a committee, or whatever, that will arise and take the next step. That is what ESIP is and does. So don't worry about the construct that is putting this forward. However fantastic, just let me emphasize the work has been. So that's number one. The other thing is, and I'm glad I interrupted, Adam, because as you're going towards the endorsement, something that's come up before has been the strength of ESIP's guidance. And I would not like to see that diluted to get something that is so high level that it looks like, for example, just saying, a Force 11 set of principles which are useless. And I led the activity where Ruth constructed a resolution in regard to ESIP's response to the Force 11 principles on data citation. And our basic idea was, oh, that's very cute. That's really adorable. No one can act on it at all. ESIP's guidelines for citation were very pragmatic. And I just want to say, please keep as much pragmatism as you possibly can in these guidelines, so that people can, a number of people have said this, people can actually use them and do good work and implement things. And that's going to get the attention and the endorsement of the Assembly. Over.
Great, thanks, Peter. I think that really resonated after Dan's talk, where he talked about schema.org and that cyclical, it's useful because people are using it, and people are using it because it's useful. And so I think we'd endeavor to be the same. So with that said, Peter, do you feel like the current guidelines that we have now hit that pragmatism, or do we need to back up at all in our materials to ESIP endorsement, or do you feel like we're on target?
I have not looked. I
Okay.
will look. I promise to.
Okay. No worries.
But I think many eyes on this is a good start. And when you go forward with an endorsement to the Assembly, it is worth indicating who's had their eyes on this for those members who, have not had their eyes on it. Just to say, oh, well, it's like one person did this. No, that's probably not going to fly. But if you've got like many eyes on it from a variety of different parts of ESIP and clusters and collaboration areas, it's going to carry forward for sure.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, so the proposal contents, essentially just a history of the work, and then a statement describing why it's a benefit to ESIP. Yeah, so certainly I feel like we've got the materials to put all that together, and we can certainly work towards that and use the next release of our guidelines as a framework to do that. And Matt, you probably alluded to more of the contents there of what goes into this proposal. So yeah, one of the questions that came up in our monthly calls was, our next release is really version 1.3, but for this ESIP endorsement, do we want to call it 1.3, or do we want to call it version 2? Or I don't know if that's a terribly important question, but maybe we should just start to chat about proposal contents.
So Adam, going back to my comment in the chat about a governance model, if there were a governance model for regular updates to the guidelines, then both of these questions don't matter in a sense, which is to say the fact that there will be forthcoming versions will be documented, that there is a process for vetting those before publication, for approving via the governance model. And then you don't really need to update the endorsement if that governance model is part of the endorsement or is part of the approval process for the endorsement, whatever it is.
Great. Yeah, I like that.
I have a wee question here. Is something like this bucking the trend? Is this what this slide's all about? Is it the fact that there's a realization that this may be bucking the trend? There may be updates to a schema, there may be updates to an endorsement, and it may happen every quarter, or it may happen every month. Is that what this is all about, Adam?
Folks, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the thought was, putting forward a minor revision version number might draw some, I won't say red flags, maybe yellow flags.
Right.
And so maybe it's more perception.
Yeah, the issue we're facing is that schema.org is a moving target, and intentionally moving target, right? This community is trying to suggest ways to improve schema.org through the process that Dan outlined the other day. And I, for one, don't want to see this endorsement meaning that we don't move forward, that we cannot continue to move forward in a useful, pragmatic way.
Yep. Absolutely.
Great. So in
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just saying, in terms of the version numbering, I don't think it really matters much, Adam. I think, if we're going to move to a 2.0, we should do that because we have some major break that we're trying to signal that there's something incompatible. I think to do that, in the spirit of semantic versioning, it seems like if we're just adding additional guidelines and they're just incrementally improving, what the recommendations say, we should just keep going down our series sequence. And unless there's some real reason to flag, one of those reasons could be that we want to flag that this is the endorsed version that came, through the ESIP endorsement process, even if it's not incompatible. So that might be the only reason to bump it, is just to sort of announce to the world, this is a major step in the process. But,
yeah, agreed. Yeah, maybe we can, is there anyone that disagrees? So we can maybe move on.
Matt, I had one more comment. And Adam, sorry. Maybe we should think about this in terms of, one thing we talked about is that we need the high-level conceptual why do I care documentation, which is sort of the high-level guidance of why does this matter? And the second is, okay, now we have some specific technical guidance that's applicable right now to the tools that are deployed right now or last month. And do those two need to be so tightly linked that we can't update them? And again, that's what I'm trying to avoid. If there's a way we can make the endorsement proposal the sort of high level goals and high level why I care and why this makes a difference, and then the implementation guidance be somehow separated slightly with a governance model, then maybe we can kill all these birds with the stone, as it were.
Yeah, I agree with you, John. I mean, maybe just for minimal effort, my vision for the endorsement proposal is a copy of the guidelines as they are in the GitHub repository with this additional document that in prose outlines the history and the work. And so maybe folks can comment on what their visions are of this proposal or the endorsement package.
From the point of view of this, Steve Richard here, from the point of view of implementing, systems that are harvesting this metadata, it seems like being able to cite a particular version and say that, this metadata document, this schema.org document conforms with this version in particular, seems like it would be a good thing. So, have the endorsement target a particular version and recognize that this is being updated and future versions might be used. And you should, and something along the lines of, you should identify which version your documents are using.
Yeah, we actually put a property into schema.org to let people do that if they care to. It's a property called schema version, I think.
Yeah.
Each release gets a number, and if you want to be super precise, you could put a GitHub ID or something. But for most everybody, a number should be just fine.
So, but Dan, our guidelines definitely go beyond. So they're further at least elucidating the usage of those schema.org terms as you've defined them. And I think, as we said, there's a fair amount of latitude and interpretation in many of the schema.org terms, and we're recommending specific ways of the community thinking about the terms. So, like the difference between, say, our Science on Schema.org guideline release 1.1 and 1.2 would, not necessarily correspond with a Schema.org version change at all, right? Can you comment on that and like how other communities might be thinking about this as well? Like this ambiguity of terminology and the way that, in the absence of guidance, different providers can use Schema.org in pretty different ways. Can you kind of comment on how that works for people beyond what I think is the obvious driver, which is people do things that make their search results show up in Google the way they want them to show up, right? Which I think is the primary driver for a lot of this. And so they do what works with the Google parsing to get that, you know, really effectively to show up in structured data boxes and stuff. But
Rich results.
There's a stack of things there. So we strive at Google for our parsers to be as compatible as possible with what you would expect from a normal RDFA parser, a normal microdata parser, and so on. JSON-LD is one of the places where it's been hard to be completely compatible. So we've focused on JSON-LD for schema.org with just the schema.org context. In terms of the meaning of the fields, they do get tweaked over time. And as a project, schema.org, I think we're generally comfortable tweaking the type property associations fairly liberally, because the alternative is to have lots of properties that do more or less the same thing, which is a big usability hit. We're pretty reticent about renaming things, even if we would look better if they were all renamed consistently. So we just kind of hold our nose and look bad. I think the shape languages, Shackle and Shex, they're not going to solve everything, but they give you a level of specificity that we're just not going to give you in the core schema.org schemas. We try and make it possible to say lots of things with schema.org. You can say a lot of things with schema.org that Google will only kind of sort of understand. You could still use it for analytics. Maybe Bing would build something with it. Maybe you folks would build something with it. What we see often is the SEO community are super enthusiastic and try and find every possible piece of expressivity. And we have to kind of bring them gently down to ground a bit. And I think for those reasons, we will nudge people towards stuff where Google has specifically documented patterns and graph shapes that we know will bring a lot of value. For the other stuff, we can still kind of use it, and it gives us hints about the page content. But frankly, all the words on the page also give us hints about the page content. And it may be better that people spend their money on making the page mobile compatible or accessible or something. So if we nudge people towards the patterns that Google understands, it's mostly to make sure that effort that goes into publishing structured data is effort that's rewarding. Because if people write a check for the work to upgrade their website, and then they didn't really feel that they got anything from that, that's not great for the ecosystem as a whole. And if your community are building other patterns and other shapes that consume different sides of schema.org, I think we should plan around, I don't know, quarterly or annual link ups and checkpoints so that we're not drifting apart, we're drifting together. And if there are patterns and shapes and meanings that are important to your community, that we make sure that propagates out and others hear about it too, and that it feeds into the vocabulary development process.
Thanks.
Great. All right, so just to make some progress here so we can get to the variable measure discussion, I think we were really targeting the ESIP summer meeting as a good date to either have the decision made about the endorsement or announce that. For folks that are in the know, how realistic is that? What's the process like? Or is that something that we should rethink?
So Adam, this is Peter. You definitely want a leader into so there's no official assembly vote at the summer meeting. And so you can trigger assembly votes really at any time. At least that's the model that I'm familiar with. Denise might chime in here. But the idea is you want to socialize this. You want to socialize it soon in increasing maybe sophistication and elaboration, and give people time for feedback. There's a minimum 1 month period for the pushing something out and having the assembly, if you like, vote on it. But you don't need to worry too much about summer as a touch point anymore. I would say that any time is fine. And in fact, I would say that not during the summer meeting is actually better, because you get more of people's attention in between, rather than when we're all, got other stuff on our mind. But I'm curious about what didn't. Yeah, right. So Denise has just added some things in here. Quarterly for partners, but you know, I still think that if there's something important, and I think this is really important, to me it could go out at when you're ready. Over.
Great.
So I'll follow up on that just a little bit. I was just saying, you know, it's like we at least already do have quarterly votes on the partners. So you don't necessarily need to target summer meeting or winter meeting. And Peter brought up some really good points about maybe targeting the summer meeting for a vote is not necessarily the best idea. However, what you could do is have it just about ready to submit for comment and have a session at the summer meeting kind of presenting it as a lead up to that submission for comment. You know, it could go out as a separate vote. We've done that for some other things. It's just, I know that people do tend to be more aware of the quarterly partner votes. And so they do try to limit the number of times that voting reps actually have to engage. So.
Yeah, great.
Thanks. And I think one of the reasons we were targeting the summer meeting is exactly what you said, Denise, that it would be really nice to have the proposed language together and kind of our agreement in the cluster and more broadly so that we can discuss it there, and then maybe it would get submitted after that. I also think it's going to take us that long to put it together. I mean, these meeting deadlines are what actually trigger activity for us. I mean, the amount of activity in the last 2 weeks has been very different from the activity that was happening before we were, you know, trying, but, you know, everybody's busy. So I think giving ourselves 4 to 6 months to finalize the next 1.3, make sure we're all happy with the content, and then write or incorporate it into a proposal document is the minimum amount of time I think we would need given the level of investment we've seen historically. So targeting the summer meeting as the point where we're going to discuss the draft that's ready to go. And then if that looks good, then we could submit it right after that. If it doesn't seem like it's ready, we might have more to do. But
yeah, that sounds great. I think that gives us enough freedom to maybe dive into more of the target dates on our maybe next cluster call. Anyone disagree with just preparing materials to discuss at the summer meeting and then submitting after the summer meeting? Going once, twice. Okay, great. It sounds like y'all want to get cooking and get your hands dirty. Is that right? So I'm going to skip this slide on the wrap up of release 1.2 and hop right into the variable measure discussion while we have folks here on the call. So just to give a little bit of background, we have got variable measured in the current guidelines, but looking for ways for data repositories, data publishers to provide more context and detail about those variables, just because they're so rich and there's a lot of great vocabularies to describe these things. And so the cluster targeted the research showcase that happened on Wednesday to present a poster. Steve Richards put together a monumental effort to gather all this information. And so, Steve, if you are willing, would you mind just sort of giving us a sort of intro on where we're at and what needs to be decided and discussed?
All right, thanks, Adam. Well, this is work that I've been working on most with Mark Schildauer and Kai Bloomberg. And the goal is to try and have better information about the variables that are in data sets. And a lot of people are already doing this to varying degrees. It's in the current recommendations. But what we discovered was that the current schema.org content, while it works for sort of simple numeric variable values in a nice way where you can have a URI for a property that identifies what the variable is about, and you can have a minimum value, a maximum value, measurement technique. These are all really useful. But if you're dealing with more complex kind of variables, so let's say things that have values from controlled vocabularies, or more importantly, some of the more common kind of earth science data sets that are in gridded structures or more object-oriented structures where there's nested values, becomes tricky. And so there was a lot of discussion about all the various kinds of complexities that we run into, and you know, sort of the realization that we don't want to try and address all of these things using schema.org, because there's already a variety of different approaches to doing this that are out there. And so, for instance, you know, EML and ISO metadata schemes both have fairly sophisticated ways of describing data structures. But more importantly, in the RDF world, there's things like QUDT for describing units and has various data types, and the W3C data cube. So there's some existing tools that are out there that are designed for doing this in a lot more detail. And so the question is to try and find the sweet spot for working with schema.org. And really the goals are to be more efficient discovery of data, so people can ask questions like, I need a data set that has, you know, river water levels or lake water levels associated with atmospheric temperature, something like that, where you want to actually be able to look for data according to the kind of information that's in there. And then when you find that data, before you actually go to the effort of acquiring the data and drilling into it, the metadata tells you something about, you know, how is this data acquired. That gives you the ability to assess what you're looking at and determine, do I want to go to the effort to actually get this and start actually figuring out how to drill into it. So that's helping user evaluate the data and determine fitness for use. So what we did in the current, the poster here is looked at a variety of different data types. A lot of this was also inspired by the work that's going on in the Data Discovery Initiative, which is really active and community largely driven by sort of government statistics people and the medical science community, much better funded than we are. Anyway, and they've got recommendations for cross-domain data interoperability, which are currently in draft mode. And from what I've seen, I think it's one of the most elegant and sophisticated descriptions of, you know, how to describe data and what data are about. So unfortunately, they don't have an RDF vocabulary yet for their work. It's right now, the current implementations are in XML. But that's aside, I think a lot of their thinking is inspired by what we've got here. I think from the point of view of you know, I won't go into all the details here, but I think a couple of significant questions are, one of the big gaps right now in the schema.org is there's no property for expressing the data type. So you can have a property value, you can't say anything about what the data type is. And they're looking around at a variety of different vocabularies and thinking about this in the context of, you know, data types. There's this RDF data type registry working group, and a lot of people are working on this. But looking at the granularity that we're targeting, it seemed to me that what we're seeing in QUDT, this quantity, units of measure, dimensions, and type ontology, which is there's an active community around it. It's got a whole lot of units of measure, but more importantly, it also has a fairly sophisticated data type vocabulary that we could use. So in the current suggestions here mostly are revolving around using QUDT for doing these data type descriptions. There's also a lot of property type vocabularies out there. So we're probably familiar with suite is one obvious one. There's the scientific variable ontology that's out there. And then, you know, there's ENVO, there's a lot of property vocabularies. So questions, is QUDT a good thing to use for describing units of measure and data types? Do we want to actually recommend particular property vocabularies for people to use? I think that's a little more fraught because it's so domain specific. And then the other issue, Adam, if you could go down to the second page here in this in the poster, just keep scrolling down. One of the big questions is dealing with what we could call dimension data. So coverages, grids, a lot of, you know, things like NetCDF and HDF kind of data where the data are described in terms of measurements dimensions, like, in a simple case, they say X and Y, or for geolocation, or in a time series, you have a time dimension and then values measured at intervals along that dimension. So describing these data types, there's a couple different ways you could do this. And, there's a couple of suggestions here. You can see different approaches to the encoding here. So the points for discussion would be, how do we want to specify data type, dimensions, and then work with dimensions data. Are there property vocabularies that the community would agree are the best ones to use? And then a third suggestion here that's also important, I think, is this, we have these other things like the data cube, the SOSA SSN ontology for describing observations. There will be a DDI RDF vocabulary, hopefully within a couple months. So how do we, is it useful to embed these more domain-specific suggestions? So right now in the top center there's vocabulary description using an external vocabulary. So this example here uses SOSA, which is a W3C recommendation for describing an observation type. Is it useful to put this kind of information in there, or do we link out? So there's a number of things that would still need to be discussed. And if you're interested, if on the schema on science or science.schema.org GitHub, if you go to the GitHub, there's a branch for its issue 27 variable measured. And within that branch, you'll find a bunch of all these example encodings. There's a discussion document that we've been working on over the last almost now, incrementally updating with the conversations with Mark and Kai and other people that are sort of give the background. And then there's a draft of recommendations that's sort of reflected in what you see in the poster here. So it'd be really good to have more eyes on this and be able to get some more input so we can actually move forward with a pull request for the data set guidelines.
Steve, I've got a question.
Yeah.
As you know, we've had some discussion about even the term variable measured, given that, in many communities and with many kinds of data, it's not a variable measured per se. So the word measured is a little bit problematic for the terms, and that it actually is kind of problematic also from a, dealing with, for example, indigenous data. And so did you spend any time trying to look at those issues at all?
Well, one of the sort of, one of our guidelines for doing this was to try to, as much as possible, use existing schema.org vocabulary. And that's why we have variable measured. And it forces you to take a much broader view of what variable measured means in terms of any kind of asserted value in a data set. When you start drilling into things like the DDI documentation and the OpenDAP data models and stuff, I mean, people recognize that you have these, your data values, your measured values, whatever you want to call them. And then there are also attributes, things that sort of qualify that. So you might have, a geothermal data set where there's a temperature measured, but then a separate field that says what the units of measure, and it might be centigrade or Fahrenheit or even kelvins or something. So you have variables that are about other variables. You have variables measures. You have things that are metadata type variables, that have to do with data management. So primary keys and data sets. There's a lot of different things like that. And, without being able to, we aren't going to add all those things in, properties for those things into schema.org. So we sort of have to shoehorn them into variable measured and property value. And that's where using this property ID then becomes important, I think, is that's where we would express the details of what kind of content is this in the data set, and really coming up with a word to talk about that is, everything every different community has different ways of talking about these things, and the language becomes really problematic. So I guess
Steve,
yeah.
I'm sorry, could I jump in? Because this
Sure.
is
Please
an
do.
issue we had discussed, but the problem I think for us was exactly as you said, that the variable measured is to be used with the type property value. But as Ruth just alluded to, we have a lot of data sets where they're actually the types in the data set itself are existing schema.org terms. For instance, there's a type of person, place, event, and observation. And in particular, so a lot of our data sets would, for instance, have a column we'd want to describe, this is the person, and this is the place, and this is the date, and this is the type of event, which is in that record. And in addition, there's also the type observation, which provides some really nice, very close alignment with like W3C SOSA by giving us the properties of measured property and observed node. So I guess the question, especially since Dan, you're on the line here, is can we use those types like person, place, event, observation, and date in particular to fill the value on variable measured and not just be restricted to property value?
First off, I'm glad the observation stuff seems to be working for you, or at least resonating with some of the work you're doing. I was just digging in the Data Commons project to find some documentation on that, because they've built their entire approach on that representation. I think
which representation, Dan?
Data Commons, which is another project from Avi Guha. They were the original proposers of the I think statistical population and observation pairing. And there was a discussion last summer with a team around the New York Times and COVID data extraction around generalizing that and decoupling it slightly from statistical aggregate data. But it didn't really go anywhere final. I think you're right. The notion of a data set that we have in schema.org was inherited from people in the DCAT working group. Years ago, before DCAT was even finished, they said, hey, you should be doing this too. And then we did. And then some other people got upset that we'd copied DCAT. But it treats data sets somewhat as a black box. And the original conceptualization was very repository centric. So you've got this kind of black box of data somewhere in a repository, and you attach some metadata to it. And I think it's a very rich area when you start looking inside the data set. And to be frank, I was kind of reticent to put even variable measured in, because it's yet another thing in this complicated, crowded space. I co-chaired the CSVW group at W3C with Jenny Tennyson, which again was mostly sort of metadata supporting collections of CSV files, but we also peeked inside the box and said, what if you've got super regular CSV files? Maybe you can use a template to turn each row into triples, and you can. And then alongside that, there was the data cube work, DDIs. It's a crowded and infinitely complicated world, and I didn't want us to blunder into it. On the other hand, data sets are horrible things to search for because they're full of numbers. So even just knowing the variables can be super useful in a project like Natasha's. So we did put a toe in the water, but really it's a toe in a giant ocean. And I'm kind of, the fact that we've done that shouldn't really be the architectural starting point for mutating it into the finished product. I think these kind of conversations are great, and we can stand back and say, where are we? What do we actually want to do with this representation? Do we want to represent all of the stuff that's in the black box that we found, the data set itself? Or are we just providing little bits of slightly dumbed down discovery metadata for directories and search engines?
I mean, it's been our experience. So I work at an ecology synthesis center, people trying to find data to do synthesis. And then often what they are looking for is data sets with particular types of measurements in them. So I think there's a lot of enthusiasm in the ESIP community, a lot of recognition of the value of knowing what are the specific measurements in this data set. So we got very excited to see this new property variable measured. but then we felt constrained by being limited to just then property values instead of using more of the relevant schema.org types as the endpoints to variable measured.
So
Yeah,
I don't
I
know.
guess
Can I ask you for a couple of examples of the types of things that you would like to see?
I'm glad you're here, Natasha. I was about to quote you, but it's better that you speak.
Well, actually, I think observation provides a pretty good model. The observation type provides a good model by giving us the ability to specify, further properties of what property was measured and what was the observed node, which really conforms pretty nicely to this notion of feature of interest and observable property in SOSA, which a lot of the repositories are trying to implement that observational data model. And
right now, the variable measured
spreadsheets, and they have columns about when the data were collected and who collected them and where they were collected and what type of event, whether it was a drought condition or a flood condition. And those are all in the data. They're not at a metadata level. So if we could just take advantage of person, place, event, observation, date, as types to be used in variable measured, we can go a lot further down the road. And then, of course, Natasha, to answer your question, observation gives us then a huge amount of flexibility to branch out to some of these external ontologies that Steve was talking to, like ENVO and SVO and those sorts of domain ontologies.
And then to extend that even further, I note that, for example, some of the data sets that I've dealt with are of indigenous observations. And so your quote spreadsheets might have, time, date, person who did it, stuff like that, a few images, maybe a video of or an audio file of the pronunciation of whatever it is they were observing. And so being able to say that, here's our data, and one of its field is a video, and one of its fields, is a sound file, and maybe, an image or any of those kind of things becomes important to those communities.
And I think I'd like to say, I think we thought about a lot of those things. And so, for instance, that to me, in the case you just mentioned, the data type for that variable would be sound recording or file or whatever it is. So I think we can handle that. And as far, I guess the one issue I had here was just in terms of, implementing JSON LD, right? So you have variable measured. The type of the value is property value. And I guess I was resisting the idea that you want to have the type of the value for a variable measured be an observation. No, the type of the value is a property value description. And like in this, if you're looking at Adam's shared screen, you can see in the top center there, we have a property value that is an observation. The property ID could be, I forget exactly what that resolves to, probably relative humidity. But basically, playing the game here of embedding an observation description from an ontology that's designed to describe observations. I think the problem of complexity, like Dan was pointing out, and I don't think we can do it all in schema.org because you can't write aggregation clients who are going to harvest this metadata that could process all these various possibilities. And so if you scroll down a little bit, Adam, there's also another case here that deals with what Mark was talking about, where you keep going down. There's a control vocabulary, that's one issue, but the composite data type. So Mark was talking about where you have variables about other variables like measure unit, measurement environment, all the context information. So that's that composite data type that's down there at the bottom. And what I was, the current suggestion here, can we scroll down a little further, Adam, or is that going to?
Sure. Is it big enough?
Oh yeah, it's good size for me.
Okay,
that's much better now. Thanends.
Okay, great.
So the thought here was, so deals with a composite value that's more like a tuple than about a value, but you end up using. So the suggestion was to use value reference and then have property values there. You say, okay, this property is a sampling location. The data type is a tuple that's a PLSS location, if you're familiar with that. And that's basically a tuple that has, there's meridians and a township and range value. Well, this might also be, there's other examples in the discussion documents where the value reference provides things like measurement context information, units of measure, things like that. So I think we can account for that. And the benefit of having all these things as property values is that when you're parsing the metadata and trying to aggregate and index things, you could scan one of these documents and just index all the property values, right? What are the property values? What are the URIs associated with them? And it gives you a way to index things more consistently without having to write a lot of really complicated parsing software to try to make sense of what you might or might not get. Looking at the variety of stuff, even in the EarthCube community, we're dealing with, much less all the, start branching out into the kind of stuff Mark's dealing with. So anyway,
Steve, can I ask a question? So
yeah.
I'm trying to follow this, and I'm pretty familiar with the whole observation model world, but are you proposing in this example that what we should be doing is basically making the type of all variable measured property value and then be able to have value reference be property values as well? Or I thought I was listening to Mark and hearing him say that he wanted to loosen the potential domain of variable measure to include at the top level types other than property value. And I'm not quite clear which of those you guys are proposing, or something else that I'm not following.
Well, I think we have a difference of opinion here. And so what I was suggesting was this property value, recognizing that that's the type of the value for the variable measured. And then when you describe the description of that property value includes things like, this is an observation, this is a person, this is all those other things, are what, have information that specifies what kind of property value is this.
Whereas I've been following the dictum, use schema.org terms where relevant, branch out when necessary.
And thinking specifically, Mark, that observation is the thing that we want to be able to get in there from schema.org observation.
The ability, I think Dan suggested possibly just taking it all the way up to the class level so we could use the full range of types that might be relevant for describing what is actually materialized as a measured, as a variable, at least, whether it's measured or not in a data set. So an attribute of a table, whether it's measured or not. There's lots of useful schema.org types that we could use to describe those columns before branching out to some of these external ontologies.
Mark, I think you're making an excellent point here. This is Lewis, and I apologise if I came in over somebody there. I'll just make a very brief comment here. I think, Mark, from the data repository point of view, it makes perfect sense. One of the things I would like to maybe try and encourage folk to think of as well is from the client perspective. When we make all these things type safe and we've got this degree of explicitness, I think there's more intelligent choices that can be made even in the data transfer within the client. Because when you're operating search engines for, your respective places of work or whatever it would be, when there's that degree and you know the type explicitly and you don't want to take that type, then you don't take it, and you can subset and you can try and optimize what it is that you're acquiring at that point in time. So that was one of the other things I wanted to just put out there very quickly. I think, Mark, you're making this, I love this. This is great.
I'd also say that by reusing schema.org types and getting those semantics, that doesn't prevent us from also branching out to these external ontologies for a more nuanced understanding of that type, because you've got the URL and identifier fields that you couldn't put in there for that purpose.
So I think this is a really interesting suggestion, and I guess what I would like to see is some example implementations like I produced here. I have yet to come across a data set where it seemed like doing that kind of thing made sense to me. So I really need to see some other implementations using that approach so that we can actually think about, okay, what does this mean from the point of view of the client? or from the data provider in terms of implementing and using this. So you know, let's get the rubber on the road. So I need some more help here with somebody to generate some instance documents using this other approach.
Can I ask for a clarification?
With some real data.
So this case where we're talking about variables measured pointing to one of several useful schema.org classes, either directly as the value of the property or somehow inside the property value structure. Are we thinking of the data set that's being described as possibly in a completely different data model, data format, or representation? Or is this for the case where somehow the data set has an RDF representation that's a graph, that it is a collection of RDF events or RDF observation descriptions?
I think the data sets we're thinking about are the whole spectrum of, you know, tabular data, JSON, XML, gridded data, NetCDF, HDF, you know.
Yeah, although I would say that
all kinds of anything.
The RDF kind of model is the rare end of that spectrum. The common end is the tabular and NetCDF and gridded data in our domain, at least. Like having an XML or an RDF model is relatively uncommon in the domain. So
you would use, say, observation or event to say that in its native representation, it describes a load of events or observations, but you would not actually map that content into that schema.org type.
No, and we have been doing that. I mean, we've talked about, there are a variety of observational data models. So observations are typically the one, although in some communities, like in the Darwin core community, they talk about events. So as being the driving sort of organizing principle. But so there are both I think everybody's been referencing the SOSA standard, because that one is where kind of there's been a really nice cross comparison of observation models in the appendix to the SOSA standard. And that's where I think everybody has sort of converged on terminology around observations and measurements that seems pretty well adopted. I guess I'm not quite clear what you're asking, Dan, but.
I thought for a second that the focus was more on allowing variable measured to characterize the types that are actually in the payload of the data set, in the content.
It is, yeah, absolutely.
So a variable would be about an observation.
Right.
Property value tells you in the metadata is how does this variable describe the observation?
So if I measure latitude and longitude, those are two observed variables, or variables that were measured as part of an observation of the spatial location of a point, for example. So the observation is associated with the point, and the two properties that were measured were the latitude and longitude under some, so they together make up the observation because they're inextricable.
Okay, so we're not going to finish cooking up a design here, but I'll happily commit to schema.org improving its work in this area and continuing these discussions somehow. I think it is GitHub, your GitHub, the best place to coordinate.
I mean, we have an extensive discussion there already, and like Steve said, there's that there's a document that kind of describes a lot of these issues in a fair amount of detail. So I don't know, do you guys want to continue developing up that document, or do you want to move that discussion into GitHub issues?
It seems to me that it's probably better for us to converge on that one issue just to help Dan and the schema.org team engage there. And certainly they can jump into our cluster calls too. But if we just make a concerted effort to, convert or migrate good discussion from the cluster calls and other activities into that issue, maybe that's the best for you guys, Dan?
Whatever's easy. I think having the issues as a synchronization point is all they need to be. You don't need to copy content.
Right. But one of the, I think in the GitHub, in that issue 27 branch, there are the examples. Again, I've been compiling, there's a collection of example data sets in there. And so I think, in doing this, I found it really useful to actually find real data and try describing that real data. and have the example data there, and then the schema.org that describes that data. I think it's a really good way to approach this.
Okay. What I'll do is I'll try and pull in the data commons people as well, so we don't have 3 discussions of the same thing.
That'd be great. Good.
Cool.
Thanks
Thanks,
for that link,
everyone.
man.
We are 2 minutes up until the break. So I just want to thank you all for your time today in progressing the ESIP endorsement and then on this specific issue. So we'll certainly be focusing on this on the schema.org cluster calls. Yes, the information, if you want to join those discussions, is in the slides and on the Science on Schema.org repository there. We meet the first Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern and the fourth Thursday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. If you'd like to join those, we'll certainly be making progress on these efforts here. If I might just take 1 minute to jump into the release slides. A couple things: we need to formalize the author list for this past release that we want to publish here. So if you want to jump in, those are the names that I have from code committers and then just contributors on the calls and the GitHub issue. If you want to add your name, please get that over to us. We can make sure that makes it into the release. Yeah, other than that, the develop branch is committed. So if you want to review anything, please check out the develop branch in GitHub. Otherwise, we'll push this on Monday. We'll give it the weekend and through Monday, and we'll get that out to you on the GitHub and send out something over ESIP.
Fantastic. Very quick question. If one takeaway from this is it, am I safe to say that this is going to be proposed for endorsement ESIP summer, or am I jumping the gun? Did we get there, or is that premature?
Yeah, so what we'll be working on is, yes, we're going to try to go for an endorsement. We'll use the summer meeting as the place to discuss the endorsement package and finalize all that up. So at the end of the meeting, we can feel confident that we can submit what we have or
All
make
right.
final changes in. Yep.
Fantastic. Very good. Very good. Great job, guys. Really, this is great. Really good job.
Well, thank you everyone for your support and time. We appreciate you having you all here. Have a great rest of the ESIP, and maybe we'll see you next Monday, February 1st at the 5 p.m. Eastern Time scienceonschema.org call. Thank you all.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Adam.